On April 24th, 1926, Bolton faced Manchester City in the final match of the FA Cup. A crowd of around 91,000 people showed up to watch the match. This was a hard-fought match and was a real defensive thriller. In the end, though, Bolton was able to come away with a late goal and a thrilling 1-0 victory. Well, I suppose that all of this is just trivial information at this point. I mean, this was like 100 years ago, right? But there were two aspects of that FA Cup final that hinted at how the sport would change over the next 100 years. The first was this somewhat sensational story of ticket scalpers being mauled by angry fans. The story itself isn't really all that clear, but it seems that some fans were upset by the exorbitant prices that certain resellers were trying to charge outside Wembley Stadium. Now, normally I would just gloss over anecdotes like that, except that this particular story was reported by multiple newspapers and indicated that 2-shilling tickets were going for as much as 18 shillings on the streets. And apparently some of the visiting fans were able to perform a bit of fraud themselves to get in. But as you saw from those newsreel clips, every ticket was sold in the end and every seat had a person. The problem that I want to highlight here is that problem of excessive demand and limited supply. This is precisely what causes those ticket scalper issues, and it winds up being a total headache for law enforcement and for fans. And the funny thing is that the same match also saw hints at a solution to that problem. London's Weekly Dispatch reported that the telegraphed results of the match were broadcast almost simultaneously in Bolton, over 200 miles away, over a loudspeaker. This was an arrangement made by a few local newspapers and seems to have been similar to arrangements made by newspapers in the United States to cover baseball games. The broadcast was relayed by a local man who was able to pronounce everything clearly with his voice amplified by the loudspeakers. Now, 1926 was a long time ago, but it wasn't that long ago. Radio, or what they used to call wireless, was already a thing. But nobody in the United Kingdom had tried to broadcast a live sporting event, not yet. However, that was about to change. The concept of football on the radio started in the United States when a college match between Pittsburgh and West Virginia was broadcast on October 8, 1921 over KDKA in Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh came away with the win in the mud and the rain. Of course, this was back in the infant days of radio, back when a full day's radio offerings could be listed in a short article like this one. This is also back when newspapers carried instructional articles to help amateur listeners construct their own sets. This is back in the real old days of radio. So England was maybe a couple years behind the times, but the situation wasn't quite as dire as you might think. The National Broadcasting Corporation, NBC, wasn't fully formed in the United States until mid-1926, and even then it took a couple of years for the network to actually really grow. And it wasn't really until 1927 that the British Broadcasting Corporation fully came into existence. The BBC came about as a public venture to replace the old British Broadcasting Company and was officially incorporated on January 1, 1927. Now, the idea of a public radio service seems to have been popularized by the May 1926 general strike in the United Kingdom that was to show sympathy with a bunch of coal miners. Newspapers around the UK closed down and only issued editions that reported directly on the strike itself. And so for a while, the real news only could spread via radio. Now, it might not seem like much in retrospect, but for those who lived through this strike was serious business. And you've also got to remember that all of this was taking place just a few years after the establishment of the Soviet Union. Anyway, you can see why there was a desire to nationalize at least one radio station in the UK. I mean, after all, at least then news could still spread in the case of a general strike. Now, it wasn't long after the BBC was established that people started talking about the possibility of broadcasting football over the wireless, and interestingly enough, college football in the United States seemed to be the model. By 1926, it was common to see college football broadcasts relayed all over the United States, as you can see in this listing from Fort Worth, Texas. This is around the time that radio was truly turning into a national obsession, and sports broadcasts were a huge part of that industry. There were lists like this one all over the United States in cities large and small. And so it was probably a bit of an understatement when this short blurb was published in English newspapers on January 1, 1927, describing the odd phenomenon of listening in San Francisco to a football broadcast that originated from miles away. The official story, as I understand it, is that this report piqued the interest of people in the radio industry in England, and so they started up a few experiments on the newly formed BBC. The first experiment was a rugby match, actually, between England and Wales. And the preview descriptions are kind of bizarre, with notes about how the broadcaster would be stuck in a small wooden shed far away from the action. It wasn't until the next week that the BBC broadcast the Arsenal and Sheffield United match. This was the first football match broadcast live on the BBC. Interestingly, the press's reaction was negative right from the start, with people complaining that the announcer couldn't be heard over the roar of the crowd. Anyway, that's how football on BBC got its start, and not long after it started, the men who owned the teams tried to have it all shut down. Calls for radio broadcasts of football matches to be banned started up in early February 1927, despite the fact that the first broadcasts were so poor. Clubs around the UK protested right away, claiming that fans would rather stay home and listen than show up to the stadium. Some fans of the sport conceded that the prospect of sitting in an armchair and listening was much more appealing than going out to watch. In general, those connected with the business of football were worried about their revenue stream disappearing. But there were also those who thought it was all in good fun and that it would increase interest in the sport. And in hindsight, I've really got to agree with those who say that broadcasting of the sport wound up giving it a lot more broad appeal. Actually, if the clubs back then were legitimately worried about attendance shrinking, they should have at least considered upgrading their home grounds. Now that's another problem for another video, but it's a problem that only compounded as the decades went on. It's also not an England-specific problem. In fact, sports in the United States and Canada were also hurt for years by poor planning and stadiums that nobody wanted to watch a game in. Fortunately, there was some room for humor, such as this Liverpool cartoon of a father pantomiming what he heard on the radio for the entertainment of his family. Anyway, a week after that Arsenal-Sheffield United match, the BBC prepared to air the first ever broadcast of an FA Cup match between Corinthians and Newcastle United. Though the BBC apparently also provided play-by-play from a few other matches, the Corinthians-Newcastle United match is the most famous. An issue of the Radio Times provided this grid system to help listeners understand what section of the pitch the ball was in. So I guess the idea here was to tell listeners which zone the ball was in and then to try to describe the action on top of that. It sounds like something that was incredibly complex. Anyway, they didn't have a whole ton of time to perfect the system since the Football League decided to outlaw radio broadcasts completely just a year later. In the throes of the Great Depression, it seems that most clubs banned their home matches from being broadcast, only occasionally giving permission as an exception. This was a pretty natural reaction given how bad the economy was at the time. By June 1931, the Football League instituted a complete ban on the broadcasting of all league football matches, and stated that it hoped that the Football Association would do the same for cup matches. While this was done ostensibly because gate revenues were decreasing, the BBC challenged that idea directly. Well, unfortunately, I'm not sure that there's a way to check up on this, since most of the statistical sources that I've been able to find don't report attendance figures by team. Now, I should note that contemporary newspapers did report attendance, but then you've got to go through each issue one by one and you've got to write it all down. That's a lot of work. However, I'm really skeptical that radio broadcasts actually hurt the sport to that extent. After all, as you know, there's a huge difference between listening to a faint radio voice telling you what number section of the pitch the ball is in and actually, being at the stadium and looking at it with your own eyes. In the end, the Football Association declined to ban radio, and the FA Cup final was broadcast every year. But the Football League ban continued. After the war, the Football League relented slightly. The new policy allowed the BBC to broadcast the second half of one match every Saturday afternoon, as shown in this article from 1949. And of course, by the late 1940s, we were already in the television era, and that radio ban started to seem really silly. Anyway, if you're interested in understanding the reluctance to allow live broadcasts of football matches on television, a bizarre policy that continues to this day, you really have to look back at these stupid policies of the 1930s. Well, the Football League made all sorts of silly decisions in those days, like this decision to not allow clubs to fly from one match to the next. Meanwhile, the same owners bizarrely couldn't come to terms on policies that allowed unemployed people to receive a discount on tickets, which certainly was even more damaging to the bottom line. In the end, it seems to me that the ban on broadcasts was more about reacting negatively against anything new than a legitimate concern for dropping attendance. Anyway, like I said, all of that's mostly just speculation. The thing is, though, that the impact of that decision is still felt in the modern era, including the eventual establishment of the Premier League in the early 1990s. So you have to remember that the decision to break apart from the Football League and go on their own came about largely because of issues with the broadcasting of the sport and the big clubs wanting the sport to be broadcast all over the world. Now that's a story for another video, so stick around on this channel and I'll cover that in due time.